The studio glowed like a galaxy trapped inside glass. Every light bulb shimmered against polished floors, ready to capture moments that would ripple far beyond the stage. Keanu Reeves walked down the corridor with that familiar quiet poise, shoulders relaxed, hands buried in his pockets, face unreadable yet calm. The network had built this evening up for weeks, a celebration of creative partnerships, a night meant to honor art and friendship. But beneath the rehearsed smiles and bright lights, something far more human stirred, a current of unspoken emotion about to break through the surface. Keanu had always carried his serenity like armor. Years in Hollywood had taught him how to breathe through chaos. Yet tonight felt heavier. For months, whispers had spread through the industry, rumors about distance between him and Alexandra Grant. Their relationship, once praised as strong and grounded, now felt fragile under the glare of speculation. Meanwhile, the internet had fallen in love again with something from the past, his long-standing friendship with Sandra Bullock. Every smile, every old interview clip of them laughing together was resurrected, captioned, and dissected until Keanu and Sandra became its own fairy tale hashtag. Backstage, Sandra stood near a mirror, dressed in a soft cream blouse that reflected the warmth of the lights. When she spotted Keanu, her face lit up instantly, her grin both nostalgic and sincere. "You ready for this?" she teased. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, his smile faint but real. There was something about her presence that reminded him of home, a rare familiarity in a world that constantly demanded performance. Their friendship had endured storms most couldn't imagine. But neither of them knew that this reunion, meant to celebrate creativity and connection, would soon ignite a moment that would change everything. Elsewhere, Alexandra Grant stood before a mirror of her own. Her dark silver dress shimmered under the backstage light as her stylist made last-minute adjustments. She had insisted on being part of tonight's interview, calling it a spontaneous gesture of love and surprise. But deep inside, another motive flickered, an unspoken fear of losing her space in Keanu's world. As she touched up her lipstick, she rehearsed words that sounded poised, elegant, safe. Still, her pulse betrayed her, drumming fast beneath her calm exterior. When the cameras rolled and the host's cheerful voice filled the studio, the crowd roared. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome two icons whose friendship defined a generation, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock." The applause thundered as Keanu offered his arm, and Sandra took it playfully. Their laughter echoed through the set, easy and natural, the kind of connection that doesn't need to prove itself. But behind the cameras, Alexandra's eyes narrowed slightly, not with hatred, but with the kind of pain that grows from love's quiet insecurity. The first few minutes went beautifully. Stories from old film sets, memories of long nights and laughter. The energy between Keanu and Sandra was warm, unforced. Then the host smiled and turned toward the side stage with dramatic flair. "But wait, we have one more special guest joining us tonight. Please welcome artist and visionary, Alexandra Grant." The applause returned, polite but hesitant. Alexandra's heels clicked softly as she entered, each step announcing more than just her presence. Keanu looked up, caught off guard, but masked it with grace. Sandra smiled warmly, but her eyes sensed the shift instantly. 3 people, 1 stage, and millions watching. None of them knew the next few minutes would echo across the world. The cameras kept rolling, but the real story hadn't even begun, because sometimes the most explosive moments in life don't start with shouting. They start with silence. The applause faded into the low hum of curiosity as Alexandra crossed the stage, her expression calm but deliberate. The studio lights painted her silhouette in silver, the shimmer of her dress catching every flicker of movement. She greeted the host with practiced warmth and took the seat beside Keanu, opposite Sandra. For a few minutes, everything appeared composed, 3 professionals on stage, smiling through the kind of tension only visible to those who have lived through love's quiet storms. Alexandra's posture was perfect, but her eyes betrayed a restless undercurrent. Each laugh between Keanu and Sandra seemed to pierce the fragile walls she had built to contain her unease. The conversation moved smoothly at first. The host asked about creativity, about the overlap between art and emotion, about how collaboration fuels meaning. Alexandra answered eloquently, describing how love and art often mirror each other, beautiful, vulnerable, unpredictable. Keanu nodded respectfully. Sandra listened, offering supportive smiles. Yet beneath that elegant dialogue, something deeper was forming, a pressure, small but building, like thunder preparing behind distant clouds. The host, perhaps unknowingly, steered the topic toward nostalgia. He spoke about Keanu and Sandra's on-screen chemistry, their unforgettable bond that fans had never quite stopped romanticizing. The audience chuckled when old clips flashed briefly on the monitors. Keanu's youthful grin, Sandra's effortless humor. Then came the question that would break the fragile balance holding the room together. "So," the host said with playful mischief, "people online have been saying Keanu and Sandra share this timeless connection. Some even wonder, were you two ever meant to end up together?" The crowd laughed lightly, waiting for the predictable witty reply. Keanu smiled faintly, leaning toward the microphone. "We've been friends for a long time," he said evenly. "She's like family to me." Sandra added with gentle grace, "Our friendship's always been about trust and respect. That's what makes it special." Their answers were perfect, human, harmless. But to Alexandra, seated inches away, every word carried weight. The laughter from the audience pressed against her like invisible static. In that instant, something inside her gave way. Maybe it was the months of online chatter, the endless comparisons, or the ache of always feeling like she was standing just outside the frame. Whatever it was, it broke through before she could stop it. Her voice, low but sharp, sliced through the microphone. "Maybe he should just go back to Sandra then," she said. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. No explosion, just ripples of silence spreading fast and wide. The host's grin faltered, the audience froze, and the energy in the room shifted instantly from light to unbearable stillness. Keanu blinked once, twice, as if trying to process what had just happened. Sandra's face softened, not in offense, but in quiet disbelief. The air inside the studio thickened with the kind of tension that has no soundtrack. The cameras caught every expression, Keanu's calm hardening into quiet pain, Sandra's compassion holding steady, Alexandra's pride flickering between defiance and regret. The host tried to laugh it off. "Well, that's quite a moment." But the attempt fell flat. Somewhere, deep behind the glass of the control booth, a producer whispered urgently into a headset. But it was too late. The moment had already escaped the studio. The internet was waiting, and the world would soon devour every second of what had just unfolded. When the show cut to a commercial break, the room exhaled in fragments. Keanu stood up slowly, his hands tightening briefly in his pockets before relaxing again. He didn't look at Alexandra, not out of anger, but because he wasn't ready to let the hurt fully form. Sandra walked over and touched his shoulder lightly. "You okay?" she asked quietly. He nodded, but his silence spoke volumes. Across the room, Alexandra stood still, realizing, too late, that pride had just stolen her peace. When the cameras came back from the break, the audience would see the same faces, but the man who sat back down in that chair would no longer be the same Keanu Reeves. When the red on-air light blinked back to life, the air inside the studio felt heavier, different. Gone was the cheerful energy that had once filled the space. In its place lingered an uneasy silence, the kind that hums right before thunder splits the sky. Crew members moved quickly but quietly, setting microphones and readjusting cameras, pretending not to notice the change in atmosphere. Even the audience, who moments earlier had been laughing easily, now sat still, their smiles cautious and eyes wide with expectation. They didn't yet understand what they had witnessed, only that something fragile had cracked in front of them. Keanu sat motionless in his chair, his expression composed but his thoughts moving with slow precision. He wasn't angry, not in the volatile sense of the word. What he felt was deeper, something closer to sadness, like an artist watching a painting he loved being smeared by an accidental hand. Sandra leaned slightly toward him, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered. "People saw what happened. They know." She wasn't protecting his reputation. He never cared much for that. She was protecting his heart. She had seen the flicker in his eyes when Alexandra's words landed, the disbelief that followed, then the quiet ache that settled just beneath his stillness. Keanu took a measured breath and looked at the studio floor, the pattern of the wood grain grounding him. "Sometimes silence lets things grow in the wrong direction," he said gently, the corners of his mouth barely moving. He wasn't looking for revenge or sympathy. He was thinking about truth, how it can either heal or fester depending on what we do with it. A few feet away, Alexandra was speaking hurriedly with a producer, her arms crossed defensively. Her heartbeat still hadn't slowed. She told herself she hadn't meant it, that the words had simply slipped out, born of frustration and exhaustion. But somewhere deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The words had come from a place of fear she hadn't yet learned to face. Now, as she glanced toward Keanu and Sandra, seated together under the lights, the weight of what she'd done pressed hard against her chest. The very man she loved most had been wounded, not by rumor, not by strangers, but by her own voice. Still, pride kept her standing tall, face calm, pretending she wasn't unraveling inside. When the cameras resumed, the host's tone carried a forced brightness that fooled no one. "We're back with Keanu Reeves, Sandra Bullock, and Alexandra Grant," he announced, smiling too wide. The audience responded with polite applause, but their energy was tentative, waiting. Alexandra straightened in her chair, chin lifted, eyes steady. Sandra smiled graciously, though her warmth now held a layer of quiet protectiveness toward the man sitting between them. Keanu, for his part, stayed silent, his gaze forward, his body language calm but firm. The host asked about upcoming projects, about creativity, about anything that could steer the moment back toward comfort, but comfort was long gone. The tension was its own invisible guest, sitting quietly among them. For several minutes, Keanu listened. He listened to the sound of his own heartbeat, to the faint hum of the studio lights, to Sandra's deliberate kindness in every answer. And as he listened, he decided he wouldn't let this moment become another headline built on misunderstanding. He would speak, not to shame, not to defend, but to realign the truth before it was twisted into something unrecognizable. When the host finally turned to him and asked, "Keanu, you've always been known for your grace and kindness, even under pressure. How do you handle moments when those values are tested publicly?" It was as though the universe itself had opened the door he'd been waiting for. Keanu leaned forward, his elbows resting gently on his knees, his voice low but clear. "Life has a way of testing us," he began, "sometimes in private, sometimes under bright lights. What matters isn't who's watching, it's who we choose to be." The studio quieted instantly. Every camera focused in, every whisper stilled. The man who had been silent now spoke with a calm that carried weight far greater than anger ever could. Sandra looked at him, knowing that what he was about to say next would change everything, not just for those on the stage, but for everyone watching. Keanu Reeves was finally about to speak his truth, and when he did, the world would fall silent to listen. The audience leaned forward, sensing something different in the tone of his voice. The studio that had moments ago buzzed with uneasy energy now fell into a deep, waiting silence. Keanu sat there, composed and thoughtful, his hands clasped loosely as though he was holding the moment itself. His gaze wasn't sharp or accusatory, it was steady, almost gentle. "Sometimes," he began, "we find ourselves in moments that test not what we know, but who we are." His voice carried softly across the room, but every word seemed to anchor itself in the air. "It's easy to stay kind when life feels kind to you. But when things get uncomfortable, when people say or do things that hurt, it's harder. That's when you find out if your kindness is real or just convenience." The camera panned slowly, catching the flicker in Alexandra's eyes, the quiet admiration on Sandra's face, and the collective breath of an audience realizing they were witnessing something more profound than entertainment. He continued, his tone neither defensive nor rehearsed, but deeply sincere. "What happened earlier," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of his words to settle, "was one of those moments." His eyes turned briefly toward Alexandra, not to corner her, but to acknowledge the truth that hung between them. "I think sometimes people forget that we're all human, that behind every camera, every headline, there's just a person trying their best to do right by others." His voice softened further. "Sandra and I have been friends for a long time. We've built a connection that's rooted in respect, not competition. That kind of bond doesn't need to be explained, and it doesn't need to be defended." Sandra looked down briefly, her expression full of quiet emotion, while Alexandra sat rigidly still, her jaw tight but her eyes glistening with a flicker of remorse she couldn't hide. The audience didn't clap. They didn't dare interrupt what was unfolding. Keanu's presence had shifted the room. He wasn't performing, he was teaching, though without ever intending to. "We live in a world," he went on, "where people are quick to take sides. But kindness doesn't belong to one person. Love, of any kind, isn't a contest. Respect shouldn't come at someone else's expense." His words fell like raindrops onto dry soil, quiet but powerful enough to awaken something in everyone who heard them. Even the host, who had been fidgeting nervously just moments before, sat still now, his usual charm stripped away, replaced by awe. Keanu didn't raise his voice once, but the emotion beneath his restraint made every word feel monumental. Sandra, with that natural warmth that had carried her through decades of grace under pressure, added softly, "True friendship doesn't need to be proven. It survives because it's built on something real." Her words acted like a gentle echo of Keanu's truth, turning what could have been confrontation into reflection. She glanced toward Alexandra, her expression compassionate but firm, as if offering her a bridge instead of a battlefield. For the first time since the tension began, Alexandra's posture shifted, her shoulders lowered slightly, and the defiance in her eyes softened into something raw and human. It wasn't surrender, it was recognition. Keanu leaned back slightly, his gaze traveling across the audience. "We all say things we regret," he said finally. "What matters is what we do after, whether we choose to add more noise or to listen." The final word lingered in the studio like a prayer. For a moment, the cameras captured something that no script could ever manufacture. Pure, silent empathy. Then came the applause, not explosive or wild, but slow, steady, and real. People weren't cheering for celebrity drama, they were responding to truth. As the segment faded to a commercial, the energy in the room felt transformed. Sandra reached out, placing her hand gently over Keanu's. He gave a faint nod, his expression calm but reflective. Across from them, Alexandra stared down at her hands, realizing that the man she had wounded hadn't just forgiven her, he had turned her impulsive act into a lesson for the world. And in that realization, her heart began to ache in a way that no apology could yet fix. The cameras might have gone dark for the break, but the world outside was already beginning to wake up, because Keanu Reeves had just turned pain into poetry, and the internet was about to explode. When the studio lights dimmed and the last segment wrapped, the applause followed Keanu, Sandra, and Alexandra like a slow-moving tide, steady, reluctant to fade. No one left the audience seats right away. People lingered, whispering to one another, as if they had witnessed something they didn't yet know how to describe. Keanu's calm words were still hanging in the air, the kind of truth that doesn't end with the applause sign turning off. Behind the scenes, the crew worked in near silence. Camera operators exchanged uncertain glances. The producers spoke in hushed tones, already planning how to handle the footage. Everyone knew it would travel fast, faster than anything they'd aired before. Keanu stepped aside, walking quietly down the hallway toward the private lounge, his pace unhurried, but his thoughts alive with the hum of what had just unfolded. Sandra followed him into the dimly lit room. She slipped off her shoes and sank into a couch opposite him, folding her legs beneath her in a comfortable, unpolished way that always made her seem human despite her stardom. "You know," she said softly, breaking the silence, "you didn't just respond, you changed the entire mood in there." Keanu sat back, holding a cup of tea between his palms, the steam rising and fading like breath. "I didn't mean to make a statement," he murmured. "I just didn't want pain to multiply." Sandra smiled faintly, her eyes tired but warm. "That's exactly why it mattered," she said. For years, she had seen people turn moments of hurt into spectacle, but what Keanu had done was something else entirely. He had chosen composure in a world addicted to chaos. Across the hall, Alexandra sat alone in a dressing room, surrounded by harsh mirror lights that showed every detail. The glint of her jewelry, the smear of lipstick she'd forgotten to fix, the faint redness around her eyes. The weight of what she had said earlier pressed down harder now that the adrenaline had drained away. She had thought she was being bold, reclaiming her place in a story that the public seemed to be rewriting without her. But now, in the stillness, she saw the truth of it. Her outburst hadn't come from strength, it had come from fear. Fear of being overlooked, fear of being replaced, fear of losing the quiet steadiness Keanu had always brought into her world. She pressed her palms flat against the table, her reflection splintering across the mirror like a painting that had cracked under pressure. Her phone vibrated endlessly on the counter. Notifications flashed across the screen. Missed calls, messages, and a flood of social media alerts. She picked it up and scrolled, her stomach twisting as she read the first headlines. Keanu Reeves handles live TV confrontation with grace, a lesson in dignity from the kindest man in Hollywood. There were still some cruel jokes, of course, but most of the reactions were reverent. Clips of his speech were already circulating, edited into short reels with captions like, "Real strength is silent, And asterisk, this is how you respond to disrespect. Asterisk, it was spreading fast, taking on a life of its own. Alexandra set the phone down and closed her eyes, realizing that the world wasn't laughing, it was learning. Back in the lounge, Keanu glanced at his phone, which had been buzzing non-stop. He didn't check it. He preferred quiet after storms. Sandra leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "You know they're going to turn this into a movement, right?" she said with a teasing smile. Keanu chuckled softly. "I didn't mean to start one," he said, his tone still grounded. "I just said what I felt." He looked toward the dark window where his reflection hovered faintly beside the city lights outside. "Sometimes all we can do," he continued, "is stay honest, even when honesty hurts." Sandra nodded, and for a moment, neither of them spoke again. It was the kind of silence that only real understanding fills. Across the city, Alexandra sat on the floor of her dressing room, her gown still sparkling faintly under the harsh lights. She played the clip of Keanu's response on her phone, not once, but 3 times. Each time, the ache in her chest deepened. He hadn't mocked her, hadn't defended himself cruelly, hadn't even flinched. He had met her anger with grace. For the first time in years, she saw the kind of man he truly was. Not just the image the world adored, but the soul behind it. And as that realization settled in, something inside her began to crumble. She didn't know it yet, but the moment she had feared most, losing him, wasn't what had hurt her. What broke her was realizing she had wounded the one person who would never have done the same to her. The world outside was celebrating Keanu Reeves for his calm, but inside one quiet dressing room, Alexandra Grant was facing the loudest silence of her life, the silence of regret. By the time the sun lifted over Los Angeles, the city's usual hum had already shifted. News outlets were replaying the clip from the previous night, dissecting it from every angle, but the story wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't about scandal anymore, it was about grace. Every word Keanu had spoken had been replayed, subtitled, remixed, analyzed. Talk shows described it as a masterclass in emotional intelligence, and psychologists were being interviewed on morning TV about why his response resonated so deeply. On social media, hashtags like #GraceUnderPressure and #KeanuSpeaks trended across continents. The world wasn't laughing, it was reflecting. And at the center of it all, Keanu remained silent, his calm becoming the loudest statement of all. In his home that morning, Keanu's world looked the same as it always did. Simple, uncluttered, grounded. He moved through his routine quietly, feeding his dog, making coffee, opening the blinds to let sunlight spill onto the wooden floor. His phone had exploded with calls and messages overnight, yet he hadn't picked it up. To him, the real work had already been done the night before. He didn't believe in performing morality for headlines. He simply believed in showing up as himself, even when it hurt. His agent called repeatedly, urging him to give an interview about the viral moment, but he declined politely every time. "It wasn't a performance," he said. "It was just the truth." And that truth, unpolished and unmarketed, was exactly why the world couldn't look away. Meanwhile, across town, Alexandra woke to the sound of her phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. She hesitated before picking it up, knowing what waited for her on that screen. The headlines were merciless. Some criticized her words, others mocked her tone, but the harshest responses weren't cruel, they were disappointed. "You're better than this," one comment read. "We all have insecurities, but hurting someone kind doesn't make them go away." Alexandra scrolled through hundreds of messages, her chest tightening with every line. She had been a woman admired for her intellect and creativity, someone known for her quiet dignity, and yet, in one careless moment, she had undone that image with her own tongue. The weight of it was suffocating. She spent the morning in silence, watching the city move outside her window. The world seemed indifferent to her turmoil. Cars rushed by, people crossed streets, the sky remained painfully blue. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like an artist or a public figure. She just felt human, small, and uncertain. The thought of calling Keanu crossed her mind more than once, but every time, shame stopped her hand. What would she even say? There were no rehearsed apologies that could undo what millions had already seen. Somewhere deep down, she knew that words alone wouldn't matter. What she needed wasn't a statement, it was a reckoning with herself. Sandra spent that same morning on her porch, sipping tea as the world buzzed around her. She had seen the chaos unfold online but refused to get pulled into it. For years, she had learned that fame could twist anything into a headline. Yet, as she read messages from strangers across the globe thanking her and Keanu for showing how adults handle pain, she couldn't help but smile softly. She wasn't proud of the attention, it was never about that. She was proud of the honesty that had come through. Sometimes, truth needed to break something open before it could breathe again. She hoped Alexandra would come to understand that too. By midday, Alexandra's publicist finally called. His voice was cautious, professional, and tired. "We need to say something," he told her. "The story's already being written without you." She stared at the wall in front of her, her voice low. "I don't want a statement," she said. "Not one of those polished ones that mean nothing. I need to figure out what I actually feel first." The line went silent for a few seconds. Then the publicist sighed softly. "Then take a day," he said. "But understand, this silence is writing your story for you." When the call ended, Alexandra sat back and looked at the half-finished canvas in her studio. For years, art had been her language when words failed. Maybe it was time she used it again, not to explain herself to the world, but to finally understand what was broken inside her. Outside, the world couldn't stop talking about Keanu Reeves. But behind closed doors, Alexandra Grant was about to confront the only critic who mattered, her own reflection. The next morning arrived not with peace, but with a heaviness of clarity. Alexandra stood in her studio surrounded by unfinished paintings leaning against the walls, their colors muted in the gray morning light. For years, her art had been her escape, a place where she could pour out thoughts too tangled to speak. But now, as she stood before a blank canvas, she felt stripped bare. The silence was almost accusatory, filled with the echoes of her own voice from that night. Every time she tried to pick up her brush, she saw the image of herself sitting on that stage, the microphone gleaming, her words sharp enough to cut through the air. Maybe he should just go back to Sandra then. The sentence replayed like a broken loop in her mind. It wasn't just a slip of the tongue, it was the mirror of every unspoken insecurity she had ignored for years. She sank onto the stool and stared at the empty canvas, her reflection faint in the glossy white surface. It struck her how much her art had always been about control. Control over color, shape, form, and meaning. But life, she realized now, didn't follow those rules. You couldn't control how people saw you, couldn't choreograph love or shape perception like paint on a brush. For the first time in a long while, Alexandra didn't want to create something perfect. She wanted to create something honest. She placed the brush down and instead picked up her phone. Dozens of missed calls blinked across the screen, but one message stood out. It was from Sandra Bullock. Asterisk, if you ever want to talk. Not for cameras, not for headlines, just human to human, I'm here. Asterisk. The message caught her off guard. She had expected judgment, distance, or even polite avoidance, but not grace. Sandra's words felt like a hand reaching through the noise, soft but steady. Alexandra's eyes filled with tears she didn't expect. Sandra had been the person she viewed as a threat, the embodiment of everything she feared losing: public love, quiet confidence, the kind of presence that didn't need to compete. And yet here she was, offering kindness where she could have offered silence. Alexandra didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't yet feel worthy of the conversation. Still, that single message lingered in her chest long after she put the phone down. Meanwhile, across town, Keanu was quietly returning to normal life, or at least as normal as life could be after the world turned a private wound into a public phenomenon. He was back on set for a new project, but even there, people couldn't help but mention the interview. Crew members whispered respectfully when he walked by, as though they were in the presence of someone who had become more than an actor. He didn't like that kind of reverence. He never had. To him, he hadn't done anything heroic. He had simply told the truth in the moment when it mattered most. When a young assistant hesitantly approached him that afternoon to say, "Your words last night helped me with something I've been going through," Keanu smiled gently and replied, "Then I'm glad they meant something to you. That's all that matters." It wasn't fame he wanted, it was quiet meaning. That night, as Alexandra sat on her balcony overlooking the city, the lights flickered below like constellations scattered across concrete. She thought about the woman she had been before all this, confident, certain, proud, and how easily insecurity had cracked that version of herself open. For the first time in her life, she began to understand that redemption isn't found in repairing your image, but in rebuilding your integrity. She didn't know if Keanu would ever forgive her, and maybe it wasn't his forgiveness she needed first. Maybe she needed to forgive herself for letting fear speak louder than love. The thought frightened her, but it also gave her a small glimmer of hope. Because for the first time in days, she wasn't running from her reflection, she was finally looking at it. In another corner of the city, Keanu sat in his living room reading quietly, a cup of tea beside him. The city outside was loud, alive, spinning with noise, but inside there was only stillness. He thought of Alexandra, not with anger or pity, but with empathy. He understood too well how pain can twist into pride, how fear can make people lash out. He wasn't ready to reach out yet, but if she ever found her way back to truth, he would be there. Not as the man she'd hurt, but as the man who still believed in grace. The world had already chosen its sides, but Keanu and Alexandra were about to discover that redemption isn't found in forgiveness from others. It begins with the courage to forgive yourself. The following evening, Alexandra sat in the center of her studio, surrounded by half-finished canvases and the faint scent of turpentine. For hours, she had been staring at the small camera she had set up on a tripod, the red light waiting to blink. Her publicist had been urging her all day to release a formal statement, a polished apology crafted by professionals and refined by lawyers, but that felt wrong. Every version he sent her sounded hollow, robotic, like something that could belong to anyone but her. What she wanted wasn't perfection, it was truth. And truth, she had learned, doesn't come wrapped in neat sentences. It trembles, it stumbles, but it breathes. Finally, she pressed record. The camera's small light came to life, and with a slow exhale, so did she. Her voice at first was soft, unsure. "I've been quiet because I didn't know what to say," she began, her eyes flicking between the lens and the floor. "The truth is, what I said that night wasn't fair, to Keanu, to Sandra, or to myself." She paused, her throat tightening as she continued. "It came from a place of fear, not honesty. Fear that I wasn't enough. Fear of being invisible. Fear of being replaced." But watching how Keanu responded, it made me realize something. He didn't defend himself to hurt me. He showed me the kind of strength I forgot existed, the kind that doesn't need to shout. She blinked back tears that caught in the light. "I can't erase what I said, but I can take responsibility for it. This isn't an apology written by a team. It's from me to the people I hurt, and to the part of myself I lost along the way." She didn't stop to edit or polish her words. There were pauses, cracks, uneven breaths, but those imperfections made it real. When she finished, she sat in silence for a long while, just staring at the still camera. Then, without overthinking, she whispered, "I want to be better than that moment," and pressed stop. It wasn't grand. It wasn't cinematic. But it was honest, and for the first time since that night, she felt something close to peace. She sent the video to her publicist with a simple message. Post it as it is. No edits. Then she turned off her phone and stepped outside into the evening air, walking through the quiet streets of Los Angeles with her hands tucked into her coat pockets, breathing in the cool wind as though it might wash something away. Within hours, the video spread. It wasn't framed by sensational headlines or dramatized commentary, just a simple clip of a woman speaking with raw sincerity. People didn't expect it. In a world of scripted apologies, Alexandra's honesty disarmed them. Viewers across platforms left comments not of mockery, but of recognition. They wrote about their own moments of regret, about words they wished they could take back. "We've all been her," one comment read. "The difference is, she admitted it." Others praised her courage, calling it a reminder that accountability and vulnerability can coexist. Slowly, the tone of the conversation began to change. It wasn't about humiliation anymore. It was about healing. When Keanu finally saw the video late that night, he didn't watch it as the subject of her apology. He watched it as someone who understood the language of remorse. The video played quietly in his home, the glow from the screen flickering across his face. He didn't move, didn't interrupt, didn't even react until the very end, when Alexandra's final line echoed softly, "I want to be better than that moment." A faint smile crossed his lips, Not triumphant, not forgiving, but peaceful. It was the kind of smile that said, she found her truth. He leaned back, took a slow sip of tea, and whispered almost to himself, "That's all any of us can do." For him, that was enough. He didn't need an apology to heal. He only needed to see sincerity. And now, he finally had. The next morning, Alexandra woke up to a flood of messages. Not from journalists or PR agents, but from strangers who had seen her video and decided to share their own stories of shame and redemption. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like the villain in a public drama. She felt like a human being again, imperfect, bruised, but moving forward. And somewhere out there, Keanu Reeves, the man whose calm had turned a moment of chaos into a lesson for millions, was smiling quietly to himself, grateful that sometimes even pain, when met with grace, can become art. The apology was just the beginning, for in the days to come, fate would bring them all back to the same stage where everything had fallen apart, but this time, the lights would shine on healing instead of hurt. Weeks passed, and the storm that had once consumed the media slowly began to settle into something gentler. What had started as public outrage had transformed into a global conversation about empathy, grace, and the power of self-reflection. Alexandra Grant was no longer being discussed as the woman who had humiliated Keanu Reeves on live television. She was being spoken of as the woman who owned her mistake with humility. The clip of her apology circulated everywhere, often paired with Keanu's original response. Together, the two moments had created an unintentional narrative of fall and redemption, pain and peace. People began calling it the dialogue of dignity. But for the three people at the heart of it, Keanu, Sandra, and Alexandra, it wasn't about hashtags or headlines anymore. It was about closure. The same network that had hosted the infamous interview reached out weeks later with an unexpected invitation. They wanted to air a follow-up, something different, something honest. A quiet conversation, not about the scandal, but about growth. At first, Alexandra hesitated. The thought of returning to that same studio, sitting under the same blinding lights, made her stomach twist. But after days of reflection, she agreed. Not to fix the past, she told the producer, but to face it. Sandra supported the idea immediately, understanding how healing sometimes requires walking back into the fire you once ran from. Keanu, when approached, listened silently before giving a small nod. "If we're doing this," he said, "we do it with truth. Nothing rehearsed." The night of the broadcast arrived quietly, without the frenzy that had accompanied the first interview. There were no sensational teasers, no tabloids lurking outside. The world knew this would be something different. Inside the studio, the atmosphere felt strangely calm. The audience wasn't there for spectacle this time. They were there for understanding. As the lights came up and the three of them walked onto the stage together, the applause that followed was warm and grounded, not wild. Keanu wore his usual understated black suit, Sandra carried her effortless warmth, and Alexandra, dressed in simple muted tones, carried herself differently, no longer guarded, no longer performing. The host, noticeably humbled by the gravity of what had unfolded weeks earlier, welcomed them with sincerity. "The last time the world saw you three on this stage," he began, "something unexpected happened. But what followed became something even more meaningful. Tonight, we're not here to revisit the moment, we're here to talk about what came after." Alexandra was the first to speak. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words were steady. "The hardest part," she said, "was facing myself. It's easy to blame others, to hide behind excuses, to tell the story in a way that makes you the victim. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw fear staring back at me. Fear that I wasn't enough, fear that people would see through me. That's what spoke that night, not my heart, but my fear. And when I saw how Keanu responded, I realized that growth doesn't happen when life is easy. It happens when you let yourself break and rebuild honestly." Her words weren't crafted, they were lived. Sandra spoke next, her tone soft but purposeful. "I think we all learned something that night," she said, glancing gently at Alexandra. "This industry loves competition. It thrives on the idea that someone has to lose for someone else to win. But kindness doesn't work that way. Understanding doesn't either. We're all fighting our own battles, and sometimes those battles make us forget that the person standing next to us is fighting too." Her gaze moved from Alexandra to Keanu, and she smiled faintly. What people saw that night wasn't just tension. They saw humanity, and I think the world needed to see that. Finally, the host turned to Keanu, whose quiet composure once again filled the room. He took a breath before speaking, his voice low and thoughtful. "What that night taught me," he said, "is that kindness isn't weakness. It's discipline. It means choosing not to add more hurt when you've been hurt. It means listening even when silence would be easier. We all stumble. What matters is how we rise, and who we help up along the way." His words drew a long, heartfelt silence from the audience. No one moved. No one clapped immediately. They simply sat in that shared stillness, the kind that only follows truth. When the applause finally came, it was slow, steady, and sincere. There were no bright smiles for the cameras, no forced laughter, just a sense of quiet relief, as though the story that had once been painful had finally come full circle. As the lights dimmed, Keanu reached across the small space between them and gently squeezed Alexandra's hand. She looked at him with gratitude, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Sandra smiled beside them, her eyes shining with quiet pride. They had all come to the stage as three separate stories, but they were leaving it as one shared truth. As they walked off that stage together, the world didn't see scandal or redemption anymore. It saw what happens when courage meets compassion, and how even the deepest wounds can become the roots of something beautiful. In the weeks that followed the reunion interview, the world carried the story forward in a way none of them had expected. The episode didn't explode with the kind of noise that usually followed celebrity moments. It resonated instead, like a quiet echo that refused to fade. Schools replayed the clip in classrooms. Counselors shared it with clients who struggled with anger or regret. Podcasts and news outlets discussed it, not as entertainment, but as an example of emotional courage. What began as a painful misunderstanding had evolved into something deeply human, a shared reminder that dignity and accountability could still exist in a world so often addicted to spectacle. Keanu, as always, avoided the spotlight. He returned to his work, his quiet life, his small daily rituals that grounded him. Yet everywhere he went, people treated him a little differently. Not with celebrity awe, but with a kind of reverence reserved for those who lead by example rather than performance. Alexandra, on the other hand, began to rediscover herself through art. Her new paintings bore no resemblance to the ones she had created before. They were raw, bold, and imperfect, splashes of color colliding with rough, unrefined strokes. Each one felt like a confession, a conversation between her present self and the woman she had been before the storm. Galleries began reaching out again, not because of the controversy, but because her work had found a new voice. When asked in an interview about the transformation in her art, she smiled faintly and said, "I stopped painting what I wanted people to see and started painting what I needed to feel." The honesty in that single sentence struck people almost as powerfully as her apology had. For the first time, Alexandra wasn't hiding behind intellect or image. She was simply human, and it showed in every canvas she touched. Sandra continued to stand quietly between them, both friend and witness. She had always been the steady center, the one who could hold chaos in her hands and soften it into something meaningful. Though she rarely spoke publicly about that night, when she did, she described it not as a scandal, but as a gift. "It reminded me that we all need grace," she said in one interview. "Not just from others, but from ourselves." Her words captured what so many felt but couldn't articulate, that forgiveness, when given freely, doesn't erase the past, but transforms it. And though she and Keanu continued their friendship as naturally as before, there was an added depth to their bond now, born from the understanding that truth and compassion can coexist even in the hardest moments. The world, meanwhile, kept moving, but traces of that night remained woven into its rhythm. Memes faded, headlines shifted, yet the heart of what had happened endured. It became a quiet benchmark, a moment people pointed to when discussing humility, strength, or the power of self-control. For once, fame had produced something worth remembering not because of its drama, but because of its humanity. And in a world hungry for authenticity, that was rare. Alexandra often thought about that as she worked late into the night in her studio, the city lights glowing beyond the windows. She didn't try to forget the incident anymore. Instead, she carried it with her as proof that even the ugliest moments could give birth to beauty if met with truth. One evening, months later, she attended an art exhibition that featured her latest collection. Keanu arrived quietly, unannounced, slipping through the crowd unnoticed until she turned and saw him standing there. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, The noise around them dissolved. He smiled, the same calm, knowing smile that had once steadied a storm, and nodded, as if to say, "You made it through." Alexandra returned the smile, small but real. There was no need for words. Sandra joined them moments later, her laughter filling the air like sunlight through glass. For the first time since that fateful night, all three of them stood together without the weight of tension or the shadow of the past. Just people, flawed and whole, standing in the quiet aftermath of growth. As the night drew to a close, Keanu stepped outside and looked up at the sky. The city hummed around him, but above it all stretched a vast, silent canvas of stars. He thought about everything that had unfolded. The pain, the misunderstanding, the unexpected grace that had followed, and he felt a simple truth settle in his chest. Strength wasn't about never falling. It was about how you rose afterward, how gently you chose to stand, and who you became once the lights faded. He smiled faintly, tucking his hands into his pockets, and walked down the quiet street, disappearing into the same kind of peace he had always carried within him. In a world that often mistakes volume for power, Keanu Reeves reminded everyone that the quietest voices, the ones that speak with grace, truth, and compassion, are the ones that echo the longest.